Hello friends, welcome back. So it has been a while and I hope you have completed your first assessment successfully. So let us resume our discussion on where we were last time. So that is, we were trying to understand the general processes that are associated with mineral beneficiation, mineral dressing, ore dressing or mineral processing. So we saw that in the previous lecture. The different techniques that are involved in mineral processing can be categorized into two. So the first technique that is involved in the mineral processing is referred to as liberation. So liberation is nothing but it is the process of separating the gangue mineral from the valued mineral or the valuable mineral. So since that during the formation of the valuable mineral or the mineral that is of use to us, the elements that are involved in the formation of the valuable mineral are relatively smaller when compared to the rest of the elements that are present in its surroundings. So if you could recollect, when we consider the geological condition that surrounds a deposit of a mineral, we saw that a given mineral is often surrounded by a specific condition. That is primarily because if you consider the different elements that are present on the surface of the earth. So if we refer to them through these alphabets, then often the mineral that is of use to us, it's based largely on some of these elements, and the rest of these elements may form the surrounding or often some sort of a geological rock. So essentially, when you mine out a particular mineral, the particle that you mine out will be of this form. So a schematic representation of a particle that you mine out will be of this form, where our desired mineral, which let's represent in green, will be surrounded by the undesired mineral. So meaning, even though the surrounding is also a mineral because of its characteristic feature, that is it is available on the surface of the earth and it has a specific chemical composition and it is not often associated with dead animals or plants, or it is not organic in nature. So whatever surrounds our desired mineral or the valuable mineral is also a mineral. We refer to them as gangue. If you could recollect, we refer to them as gangue. And there is so in this discussion and the subsequent discussion wherein we are trying to make a distinction between gangue and the desired mineral, we refer to the impurities or the mineral that is not of interest to us as gangue, while we will refer to this valued mineral or the mineral that is of interest to us as just mineral. So in this context of liberation or the overall process of beneficiation of the minerals, wherein we are trying to distinguish a set of minerals that are not important to us, that we treat as impurities, we will refer to them as gangue, and the other mineral that is of interest to us, we will refer to them as minerals, even though both these are minerals, but for our sake of the ease of communication, we will refer to one as gangue, the impurities as gangue, and the other which is of interest to us as minerals. So this I hope you are clear with. Now essentially what we have is, we have a setup, we have a particle that needs to be processed that comprises of a huge amount of impurities or a considerable amount of impurities that we refer to as gangue and the desired minerals encapsulated by these impurities, and this we refer to as the minerals. Now we saw that the liberation, the process of liberation essentially involves breaking down these whole particle into smaller pieces. So this we refer to as the comminution. So the process of liberation involves breaking down the particle that has been mined out, the huge particle that has been mined out, that wherein our desired mineral is encapsulated by the gangue. What we are attempting to do now is to liberate the desired minerals, and this we are doing by breaking down the whole particle into small pieces. So breaking down this whole particle, essentially what it does is, when you break down this whole particle, it essentially separates or it renders us large two different types of smaller fragments. If you break this whole particle as in the form of this mesh that is being shown here, that is in red, if you break this down in this format or in this form, what essentially you would be having is you would be having two different types of particles. So one is referred to as the free particles and the other is referred to as the locked particles. So what we mean by free particle is, so you are considering a larger particle that has been mined out, you are breaking this down into smaller, breaking this particle into smaller fragments, and when you fragment it out, you will the particle that results, the smaller particle that results after the comminution process can be categorized into free and locked process or locked particles. So these free particles here they comprise of either the gangue or they comprise of either the mineral. So if you could take an example, the free particle here could be this one, which entirely comprises of the gangue, or could be this one, which entirely comprises of the mineral. So the free particles that are the whole category of fragments that come out of comminution process can be categorized as free and locked, and within the free, so the free comprises of just one category of mineral. So the free particle can either be minerals or they can either be gangue. So here the particle 1, which is a free particle, it is completely made up of gangue, so it's a gangue particle, and the particle 2 here, it is entirely made up of the mineral, so it is a mineral particle. Now the locked particles, so let me use a different color, so blue. So the locked particles here, these are the particles that have, or they have the combination of both gangue and the minerals. So an example of this is here, the particle or the fragment number 3, which comprises of both gangue and mineral. So essentially what we have is, we have, even though the fragments that we get after the process of comminution, even though we can categorize them into two, largely into two, that is free and the locked particles, if you look closer, even the free particles, they comprise of gangue and the minerals. So free particles, they comprise of gangue particles and mineral particles. And in the locked particles, what we have is, we have a combination of both gangue and mineral in a single particle. So the distinguishing factor for the free particle is that the chemically free particle is homogeneous. So when you consider the chemical composition of free particle, it is either made up of the chemical composition of the gangue or it is either made up of the chemical composition of the mineral. However, in case of the locked particles, what we have is, we have an inhomogeneous chemical composition. It combines both the gangue and the mineral, and they are associated within a given particles. Now, even though all the fragments that we get from comminution can be categorized into two, depending on the chemical content of each of these particles, they can be further be subdivided into three, that is gangue particle, mineral particle, and a combination of gangue and the mineral particles. So that is gangue particle, which needs to be discarded, that is we refer to as the tiling, and the mineral particle, which is of desire to us, so therefore we let it be, or we refer to those particles as mineral particles. And finally we have those particles, that is the locked particle, that combines gangue and minerals. This we refer to as middlings. So what we essentially have is, when we fragment or when we introduce or induce the process of comminution, so you have your ore or mineral particle. So this is your starting point, and when you introduce comminution into it, then you would end up with three different types of particles. One is the purely mineral particle, and the other is the gangue particle. These are chemically homogeneous, and these are referred to as the free particles, because even though these have these can be impurities, or these can be our useful mineral, chemically they are homogeneous. There is no interaction, or there is no coexistence of the gangue and the mineral. And the other particle is the combination of gangue and the mineral. So this we refer to as the locked particle. and this has the combination. This is not chemically homogeneous, and it has the combination of our desired mineral and the impurities associated with it. Now, what essentially needs to be done is, this will be discarded. Let me use a different color. So this will be discarded, and this will be treated as a tail, or rather something that can be discarded without much of a loss to our overall process, or something that needs to be discarded. So this is referred to as tailing. This is our desired mineral, and this is referred to as meddling. So this is referred to as meddling. Now what essentially is done is, these two processes, or these two particles rather, they will undergo their unique or their characteristic sub-techniques, or the process that ensues this comminution will be different for these different particles, meaning the gangue will be discarded, the mineral will be further be treated, while the gangue and the combination of gangue and minerals in the large particle will further undergo subsequent comminution. So one of these three outcomes, or one of these three category of particles, will further undergo comminution, and this subsequent comminution will also give you gangue and mineral, so tailing and minerals. So what we mean by that is, when you consider the overall particles like we have considered in the previous slide, when you consider the overall particle that encloses our desired mineral, the particles which has the combination of the mineral and gangue will be subjected to a subsequent comminution. So only these particles will be subject to subsequent comminution. So even though these particles, the rest of the free particles, might be of a larger size, and initially even though the gangue and the locked particle will also be of the identical size, what essentially will be done is, the gangue or the locked particle, the combination of gangue and the mineral particle, will be subjected to subsequent comminution. So therefore only the locked particle will or the reduction of the locked particle sizes will be involved. So the reason we need to consider, or the reason we need to consider or treat this locked particle separately, is because a significant portion of the monetary resources is being fed into the process of liberation. So essentially we saw in our previous lecture, wherein we wanted to we considered, or we talked about the position or the place of mineral processing in our overall scheme of things, wherein we are required to deliver a given material to for a particular application. In that, the monetary resources played a role. So we have to be very careful about how we place or where we place our monetary resources. Now supposing we introduce, or we consider that, or we determine that by reducing the size, the overall size of the particles, we will be able to arrive at a large amount of mineral particles. So from the very first step, if we say that by further reducing the overall particle or overall size of the fragments, we will be able to arrive at a large portion of the minerals, even though it might be true, the amount of resources, monetary resources specifically, that is involved in reducing the overall size or the overall size of the fragments that emerge from the original ore particle will also be higher. So supposing instead of treating just the gangue particles, or instead of reducing the gangue particle size alone, if we initially treat the whole of the fragment in such a way that we end up with identical size for both the gangue particles or both the locked particles and also the free particles, of course this will help us get a significant portion of the free mineral particles. However, the amount of investment that gets into the process of comminution will be higher. So there are two ways for us to go about it. So supposing you have a smaller particle size, of course it will render us, say particle size 1, of course it will render us a significant portion of mineral particle, and this will also prevent the subsequent or the iteration step or the introduction of the locked particle into subsequent comminution. So the ultimate size of the gang particle or the locked particle will be initially arrived. So the subsequent or the iterating comminution will not be required for the locked particles. However, when we do so, the amount of money that is being spent will increase. So it is possible for us to begin or introduce or arrive at the size of 1 from the initial stage onwards, so that we are able to liberate significant amount of mineral particles. However, when we do that, it will become very much expensive. On the other hand, we can take this iterative process where we initially produce a large, noticeably large particles of size 2. When we consider noticeably large particle of size 2, it will produce a substantial amount of locked particles. Of course, it will produce substantial amount of locked particles, but now we can consider only these last particles for the subsequent comminution and reduce its size alone. So we are reducing the size of the locked particles alone. Then by doing so, we will be able to enhance the already present amount of mineral particles. So there are two ways for us to address this liberation process, where we have our mineral locked within the gang. So essentially, when you over out, you have a particle such as this, a large particle such as this. So over are a mineral particle such as this, where you have your mineral that is blocked with the gang. Now, when you want to fragment this whole particle, there are two ways to go about it. You can fragment it into smaller pieces, thereby not requiring for subsequent or a reiterating treatment of or iterating treatment of the locked particles. You can, at the very first go, you can go for this, or you can reach this particular size here. However, the problem is the amount of the reduction that is required for your comminution process. This amount, when you want to achieve a very small particles at the very first go, the expense that is involved will be considerably higher. So therefore, a better alternate for this is you begin by fragmenting the initial particle, the mineral particle, into larger size particles, and this of course will give you a noticeable amount of the locked particles. And now, instead of fragmenting all these particles further, you can just separate the locked particles and then treat them or fragment them separately. So even though ultimately in case of in the first case you would arrive at particles of homogeneous sizes, the expenses will be large. In case of the category 2 or the approach 2, you will arrive at different particles of different sizes. However, the money spent will be quite less, because ultimately you are separating the free and the locked particles, and it is only the locked particles that are subjected to subsequent comminution. So purely for when you consider the economic perspective, the fragmentation, the comminution or the size of the fragmentation that is involved needs to be balanced. So there are different factors that needs to be considered when you are choosing the size of the fragments when you are performing a comminution on a given mineral particle. So these different factors, it involves, first of all, the amount of mineral particles that is being liberated. So this is what our ultimate aim is. So it should be possible that we are able to liberate a decent amount of mineral from the ore particle or the mineral particle. So this is our goal, and this needs to be satisfied. Of course, this is the reason why we are investing our money in the first place. So this cannot be compromised. Secondly, however, we need to consider the economic factor as well. So of course, it is our aim to liberate the minerals from the overall particle, but this should not happen at the expense of the monetary investment that we are making. So the ultimate profit that we are making, or that we are intended for, should not be reduced because of this comminution alone, or because of this process alone. So therefore, a better way of going about is we initially subject this ore particle to a comminution which renders us a larger sized particles, and from there we separate out the locked particles and subject that locked particles alone to further comminution. So in this way, we are able to reduce the monetary resources that is being associated with the comminution process or the liberation process. Now, even when we subject the locked particle to subsequent comminution, it cannot be happening or it cannot be going on forever. Even though every comminution steps will give you or will increase the amount of mineral particle or free mineral particles that is present or that will be in a given set of fragments, even though for each and every comminution process, this mineral free particles will increase. The particles of desired mineral will increase. This cannot be keep going on forever. We need to have a point wherein we should stop the subsequent comminution of the locked particle, and this is decided by the ability for us to efficiently handle the particles that come out of the fragmentation. So essentially, we have three different factors that needs to be considered while deciding the process of comminution, the process of liberation. So the first factor is how much amount of mineral are we able to get out of this particular mineral particle. How much amount of the desired mineral are we able to liberate out of this large particle. Secondly, how much money is being invested for this liberation alone. So how much are we ready to invest our monetary resources on this liberation alone. Now for this monetary aspect, we will be considering, or we have introduced a way for the optimal use of our monetary resources. We have considered a way wherein instead of fragmenting the ore into identical sizes, even though initially we will do that, the locked particles alone will be subjected to subsequent comminution process, and the outcomes of this locked particle will then be assessed, and then if there is a possibility of further liberation of the minerals from the secondary locked particles, even that will be subjected to subsequent comminution. So this will be economically beneficial to us, and ultimately such an approach will not give us identically sized particle, but rather it will be economically beneficial, and this will increase the portion of the free particles that are available to us. And finally, this iteration process of subjecting the locked minerals to comminution, it will stop, or a factor governing that is the ability to handle the mineral or the ability to handle the particles. So these three factors, that is the amount of mineral that is being liberated, the economic investment that is associated with it, and our ability to handle, these three, they combine or they cumulatively decide the process of liberation and the process of fragmentation. Now, we saw in the previous lecture also the first factor, that is the amount of particle that we liberate from a given ore particle, is we refer to them as the degree of liberation. So this degree of liberation is nothing but the amount of particle, so amount of mineral particle, which is again free, that is being liberated from, during or through a given comminution process with respect to all the particles that are being produced from the comminution into 100. So this helps us quantify the amount of minerals that we are able to liberate from a given ore particle or a mineral particle. So from this expression, we will be able to understand, or we will be able to quantify the first factor using which we are devising our liberation technique. So this is the first factor, and we saw the second factor is the economical aspect. So this economical aspect, in order to be optimum, we follow a flow chart, or we follow a process chain where, except for the particles, the locked particles are subjected to subsequent comminutions, and the size of this comminution, or the size of the end product, is decided by the ability to handle. So essentially what we are doing is, instead of subjecting the whole of the particle to a specific comminution, ultimately giving us a specific size, we will start with the larger fragment. We will start by producing larger fragments, and from that we will separate out the free and the locked particles, and only the locked particles are subjected to subsequent comminution. This way we are being economically optimal, and the number of times that the locked particle will be subjected to the subsequent comminution is dependent by, or it is governed by, our ability to handle it, because usually in an integrated plant, wherein mining happens and also processing happens and also the extraction happens, those are we refer to as the integrated plants. Or of course, if not mining, processing and extraction happens in a single setup. So that is what we refer to as the integrated plant. So mining might happen somewhere else, but both processing and the extraction happens in a single plant. So in plants such as these, the processing happens in a separate arena and the extraction happens in a separate arena. So you need to transport your liberated or your comminuted particles from one arena to another arena. So it might be a distance of few kilometers, and so this transporting, there should not be a loss of minerals during this transportation. So therefore our ability to handle a given particle comes into play when we are deciding our liberation technique. And in addition to that, since these minerals, because of their composition specifically, they are hazardous to our environment, and therefore when you have smaller sized particles, mineral particles particularly, or even gangue particles as well, they contaminate our surrounding, and it becomes really hazardous for the human resource that surround this operation. So therefore these are the factors. So when we talk about ability to handle the particles, two factors come into play. One is the loss of the resources, the loss of the minerals during the transportation, and secondly, and more importantly, or most importantly, is the environmental hazards these mineral particles of smaller size pose, and the safety issues that are associated with it, and how hazardous are they to the human resource that surrounds this operation. Now, for this discussion's sake, we have considered a simpler setup of a particle such as this. So this type of particles we have considered so far. So this is just a schematics of how a mineral particle when mined looks like. So this is how it is, for our understanding we have posted it this way. However, when you consider, when you look into, when you observe the actual particles that are being mined out, they would be rarely of this form. The way they would appear is something like this. There will be some portions of the desired particles that are rather irregularly shaped, and some might appear in the form of smaller pockets of our desired minerals. So some might be like irregularly shaped, and some of course might be regularly shaped. So all these appear within a given ore particle. So very rarely you would find, or you would mine out a ore particle that looks something like this, wherein for a given particle our desired mineral is completely encapsulated and is rather located in a specific position. So this kind of setup is very rarely found. The way we observe minerals in a realistic condition within a given particle, within a given mined out particle, is something like this. So this is the physical case, and this is rather an illustrative theoretical case, and very rarely it is being observed. Now, the reason we need to consider a physical case such as this is because when you consider a physical case such as these, or physical conditions such as these, what happens is that very rarely you would be able to identify, or you would be able to find out, or you will be able to realize the free particles when your particle that you have mined out is of this form. Unlike this, when you have a particle, an ore particle or a mineral particle that is being mined out, when it is of this physical case, or when it is close to this representation we have of the physical case, then what essentially happens is that the free particle, particularly of the minerals, that is of the primary importance to us, will be minimal. So what essentially would be the end product of the comminution of the physical or the physical mind particle, the physically or the mind particle that you observe in a physical instance, when you perform the comminution on such a particle instead of this rather schematic particle, when you consider a physically realistic particles wherein instead of having a rather confined specific location of our desired mineral, it is either distributed as small pockets in this manner, or it has a shape that is not regular but rather elongated, or some of it might be in this manner wherein resembling the schematic representation. When you impose such a realistic particle to comminution, very rarely, the first observation is very rarely you would observe free mineral particles. So very rare, it's the amount of free mineral particles that would be produced through the first step of comminution, through the first comminution process will be very minimal when compared to the purely theoretical one, that is the schematic one. So what would be the high percentage? If you consider the high percentage of the category of particles, it would be locked particles. So in purely theoretical case, which we use to understand the different factors that are involved in devising the comminution, or different factors or how the process of comminution is being planned, for that we consider to understand the basics of how comminution helps us liberate the gangue from the mineral. For that we consider the schematic particle, and in that schematic particle, when we perform the fragmentation or comminution, the large proportion of the particles that were produced, they are free particles, and only the fewer particles that were produced were the locked particles. And it was the locked particles that were subjected to subsequent comminution. So that is the reason why we spent quite some time, even though it was expressed in the previous lecture already, the reason why we spent quite some time to understand the flow chart or the process flow is because one, it's been a while. Two is because this process chain will help us understand or associate our understanding to the physical condition, how in physical condition this flow chart might change. So the changes that happen when we consider the physical particle is that in case of the schematics that we have considered, it is only a small portion of the particles that are being produced during the comminution, they are locked particles. However, in the physical case, it is the significant portion of the particles that are produced are locked. So that means a considerable portion of the particles that are produced from the initial comminution needs to be subjected to subsequent comminution. So when you mine out a particle that is close to the ideal case, that is close to the schematic one, the difference is the amount of locked particles that are produced from the first comminution will be quite low, and the free particles will be greater. However, because of the distribution of our desired mineral within a physically observed mineral particle is something of this sort. It is not rather confined like this. It is not available at a specific location. So when you have such a setup, then the portion of the locked particles that are generated will be noticeably higher. So it means the portion of the particles that are subjected to the subsequent comminution will also be higher. So if you consider the different fragments that are produced by the comminution of the physical particle, not the schematic one that is shown here, but the comminution of the physical particle that is shown here, then the particles that are produced can be very rarely they are free particles. A large portion of it will be something like this. They will have a large portion. So the large portion of it will be locked particles, and these locked particles will also be of different features. So one of the locked particles might have a large portion of our desired mineral, and in contradiction to this, another locked particle will have a very small portion of our desired mineral. So in case of a physical condition, in case of a mineral particle that has been mined out, when you observe it from a mine, and if you observe it, if you study its chemical composition, you will observe that it is very rarely of the schematic setup that we have seen, and it will be of this form, wherein the minerals are not confined to a specific position, and they do not often assume a regular shape. They might be elongated shape, they might have some shape that cannot be easily described or numerically described, and it is also possible they are found in small pockets that are mingled, or they are interlocked by several, interlocked by the gangue mineral. So like this here. So you have a setup such as they are in the form of small pockets, and here they are in the form of rather ill-defined shape, and here we have a shape that is quite we are able to perceive. So all these combinations occur in a physical system, and when you fragment this particle that you have in a physical system which is often you mine out from a given plant, then when you fragment it, very rarely you would find, or the amount of free particles that is being produced is quite small. Relatively, when compared to the schematics that we have seen, it will be hugely small. The amount of free particles, be it of gangue or be it of mine, will be small. So what you will be largely getting is the locked particles, and even the locked particles, they will be of different types. So one type of the locked particles is it will have a noticeable amount of the mineral associated with it. The other, the contradicting or the pole spark form of this locked particle is one where you have very small fraction of the mineral associated with it. And a third category of the particle that has been gone through the first set of comminution, you have the third fragment that you would get after the comminution of this large physically available mineral particle will be something like this, wherein the pockets, it remains the same. So what essentially we have is, we have a fragment wherein the availability, the way the minerals are available in the large particle is the same way it is available in the fragments as well. In addition to all these particles, we will also have another category of particle wherein there will be a portion of a considerable portion of the minerals, but it will not be as high as this one here or as low as this one here. So it will be somewhere in the middle, something like this. So when you impose the process of comminution to a physically observed, a realistic mineral particle, you observe two differences. When we exclusively consider the schematic representation of our particle that is being mined out and impose the comminution on it, we observe that a noticeable portion, or the large portion of it, would be the free particles, and only a relatively smaller portion of it will be the locked particles, and this is the smaller portion will be subjected to the subsequent comminution. However, when we move away from the theoretical consideration to a physical consideration, talk about the mineral particles or the particles that are mined in a realistic case, then in such a condition, the large portion of it will be the locked particle, while it only the lower portion of it will be the free particles, be it gangue or the mineral particles. And even the locked particles, they will not be homogeneous, they will not be identical, they will be of different forms. So one of the form is that it will have a significantly larger portion. One locked particle, one form of the locked particle, they have significantly larger portion of the desired mineral. The other form of this would be, let's say, A here. So the form A, it has significantly larger portion of our desired mineral. The B here, the form B, or the type B of the fragments will have a very low amount of mineral associated with it. And the type C, it represents the way in which the mineral is present in the actual larger particle. In the type C fragments, the mineral particles that are observed will be in the form it is observed in the actual larger particles. So this mineral particle will not be homogeneous, and it will not appear as a single particle, or it will not appear localized, but rather they will be distributed as smaller particles, or it will be distributed as smaller pockets of minerals within the given fragment. And in case of D, we have a portion of minerals that are not as high as A but also not as low as B. So if you consider these four different types of locked particles that form the significant portion of the fragments in case of a physical condition. So in case of physical condition, the larger portion of the fragments that you get will be of the locked form, and even when you look closely into these locked particles, so there the locked particles, we in case of the theoretical condition, we consider just one form of the locked particles, but in the physical case you have different forms of the locked particles, and in this different forms of the locked particles we can categorize them into these four different types. The first type, it has a huge portion of minerals associated with it. The second type, a very small portion. The type B, a very small portion. Type C, it reflects whatever form of minerals that is present in the larger particles in the smaller fragments. In type D, it is neither large nor small. Now, when you have a condition, when you have a distribution of or a distinction of locked particles such as this, here we can now, based on the amount of minerals that are present in these fragments, or the locked particles, we will be able to grade them. Meaning, when you have a huge portion of the locked particles, such as in case of type A, we can refer to them as high grade particles and treat them similar to that of the free particles that comprise exclusively of our desired mineral. So, in case of fragmenting or imposing comminution on a physically available mineral, we get these four types of fragments, the four types of locked particles, and in that, when you have a category of locked particles which is predominantly comprised of our desired mineral, we refer to them as high grade particle, and this is treated like that of the free particles which comprises exclusively of the mineral. So, even though there is a small portion of the gangue associated with this in this locked particles, since that portion is considerably small when compared to the amount of mineral associated with it, we can refer to this as high grade particles and treat them similar to that of the free particles that exclusively comprise of minerals. And similarly, the type B, we can refer to them as the low grade particle, and we can discard these type B along with the free particle that exclusively comprise of the gangue mineral. So, the four types of particle that can be we can categorize the locked particles into A, B, C and D. The first two can be designated as high grade particles and low grade particles. Even though both these are locked particles, even though they are not chemically homogeneous and they combine both mineral and gangue, the reason we are able to categorize these high and low grade is because of the relative percentage, the relative amount of gangue and mineral composition present in them. When the gangue composition in a given locked particle is so small, we refer to them as high grade particles and treat them similar to that of the mineral particles, free mineral particles. And in the same way, when the amount of the gangue associated with a locked particle is significantly higher, we treat them as similar to that of the exclusively gangue particle and we will discard them. So, even though this comprises of a portion of the mineral particle, this will be discarded. The type B will be discarded. In the same way, even though this has a small amount of gangue particle associated with it, this will be treated as the exclusively mineral, a free particle with exclusively mineral composition and moved on to the next stage. The reason is because in order to liberate the mineral and the mineral particle or the mineral from this already fragmented or from this locked particle, we need to significantly reduce the size of these particles. And therefore, and since the significant reduction of the size means increase in the amount of expenses, and also the handle the ability to handle also greatly decreases, we treat them as close to free particles, and depending on what is the amount of the mineral or gangue that is present, we treat them as free mineral particle or free gangue particle. Now, what we ultimately arrive at by categorizing A as high grade and B as low grade is that even though when you consider an ideal condition, even though when compared to an idealistic case, the amount of locked particles that are rendered during the comminution of a physically mined out larger particle, since we are able to categorize the locked particles into high grade and low grade, the amount of locked particles will be reduced. So essentially, by categorizing these locked particles into high grade and low grade, what we have done is we are now in the position wherein we will be treating only these two as the locked particles. So we have essentially reduced the amount of locked particles. So what we have is, so physically when you impose, or in a realistic case when you impose a comminution on a physically mined out particles, first thing that you observe is the amount of locked particles, the proportion of locked particles that is produced is huge. And it is really difficult for us to treat all of this as locked particles and impose further comminution, because again it will increase our expenses. So for that, what you do is you study these locked particles, this huge proportion of the locked particles, and then you distinguish them into high grade locked particles and low grade locked particles. The purpose of distinguishing this into high grade and low grade locked particles is because the high grade locked particles can be treated as free particles, free mineral particles, so they can be treated as mineral particles exclusively, and the low grade particles, they can be treated as gangue particles exclusively. So when you introduce or when you categorize these into four different types of locked particles into, or realize four different types of locked particles from the four different types of locked particles, high and low grade, you are essentially reducing your burden by 50%, or you are largely reducing your burden. If not exactly 50%, you are significantly reducing your amount of locked particles that needs to be fed into or fed for subsequent comminution. So this again optimizes your process of your the overall process chain and the process of feed that you will be rendering or providing into the fragmentation process. So in the realistic case, often it is not the free particles are often not of chemically homogeneous condition. These high grade particles are also often treated as free mineral particles, and the low grade particles or low grade locked particles are often also treated as the free gangue particles. Now when we have identified a category of the initially fragmented particles into high grade and low grade and processed them accordingly, so it is just the type C and type D that needs to be fed for subsequent comminution. And when we feed them into subsequent comminution, all we are essentially doing is breaking them down again, and depending on the ultimate size reduction, or depending on how much size reduction we impose on these type C and type D, we will correspondingly be able to liberate these minerals locked into these particles. So we will try to understand how one can, or what steps one can take for liberating these particles from the locked particles in the realistic case in the subsequent lecture. So in the subsequent lecture, we will exclusively focus on these types of locked particles that arrive in a physical instance, and we will try to consider what approach or what is the property that governs the approach that take when you want to liberate a given mineral from that of its particle. So with this I would like to wind this lecture up. And I know largely this has been a recapitulation of what I've seen in the previous lecture, but one key difference is that here we have considered the realistic case of the particle that you mine out, and how we need to treat this realistic fragments in order to be more efficient and economically more optimal. So we will see ourselves in the next lecture, where we will try to understand ways or identify the property that helps us liberate the given mineral from a particle of type C and D. Goodbye.